Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and this is Stitched Up. So welcome back to another Top Tip Tuesday. And firstly, I want to apologise for not getting a Top Tip Tuesday out last week. I did intend on doing it, but unfortunately time just ran away with me. But I'm back this week, and this week we are going to be tackling how to do a bias bound armhole. And I'm going to show you how I do it. There are two methods that I'm going to show you. One is for the bias tape to be exposed and encase the raw seam, and the other method is where the bias tape is completely concealed on the inside of the garment. Nothing wrong with either method. It's entirely up to you which method you want to choose, which you prefer. So this is what we're going to be doing. I will show you on my little sample here. So this is the method where the bias tape conceals the raw edge, but it's exposed so you can see it. And then this is the method where the bias tape is completely enclosed on the wrong side of the garment and you don't see it from the outside. So I'm going to show you how I do both methods now. I don't know why my camera keeps doing this like thing. I don't know. I'm really sorry if that's irritating you, but yeah, we're gonna go get on with it, and you can ask me any questions down in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts, which method you prefer. What I do want to just let you know is that when I do the fully concealed version, personally the version I'm showing you here is that I'm going to show you how it is fully stitched in place on your sewing machine. But my preference, to be honest, is if I'm ever using this method, I will hand stitch it down so that I've got invisible stitches so you can't really see it from the right side. That is just my personal preference, but I thought for the benefit of this vlog it would be a good idea to show you how to do it on your sewing machine, because I know lots of people don't like hand sewing and want to do everything on the sewing machine, and actually sewing this down on your sewing machine without getting lots of puckering, etc., is quite tricky. So I thought I would show you how I do it that way in case that's the way you want to do it yourselves. So we're going to get into it, and I just wanted to say that probably next week there will not be another Top Tip Tuesday from me again, because I will be on holiday and I don't think I'm going to get the opportunity to do another tutorial before then. So please don't worry if I'm not back next week. I will hopefully be back with you the week after when I am back from my holiday. So we'll jump right into it and I'll see you next time. So here's my sleeveless bodice sample that I'm going to be demonstrating how we bias bind the armholes. And first we're going to take a look at bias binding. What is bias binding and the different sorts? This one here is a jersey bias binding that I recently received in a Beyond the Pink Door subscription box, and I've never used jersey bias binding before, but as you can see here, it's got a double fold on it. This one is a Specky seamstress one, which is quite a narrow width, and it's got these gorgeous flowers on it. This one is a satin bias binding that I have in my stash, and I'm not sure of the width of it altogether. It's probably about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, something like that. But obviously satin bias binding is really nice because it's quite drapey and lightweight. And then this one here is a cotton bias binding as well, which is much more sturdy, and yeah, you can see the sort of edges that unfold here, and you can see the stretch on it there, and if I hold it up closely you can see how it's cut on the cross weave of the fabric. What you can also do is you can make your own bias binding, and I tend to make my own. If I'm honest, I'd usually make it out of the fabric that I am using for my project so that it matches, but obviously it's entirely up to you whether you want to use the same fabric or you want to have it contrasting. Now I've got my cutting board here and you can see these lines on it, and this helps you to, if you've got something like this, it helps you to find the actual 45-degree angle of your fabric so you can cut it directly on the bias. What you can do is, while I'm just playing about with my quilting ruler here to find the right angle, is there is also another way of making bias binding, which you can do continuous bias binding out of a small square of fabric. I'm not going to show you that today. I can do it as a separate tutorial if you would like me to, but today I'm going to do it the way that most people do it, which is to cut strips on the bias and then join them together. So I'm just having a little play with the fabric here, but on these quilting rulers as well, they do have a 45-degree line on them, which I will be showing you in a second, because my quilting ruler is quite old and a lot of the lines on it are faded now. But yeah, they do have a 45-degree angle on it, so you can line up the straight edge with the straight edge of your fabric, and then you can find the true bias at 45 degrees. So I've been spending a bit of time faffing about, as you can see, there we go. Look, I'm showing you the board again with all the different angles on there, which, you know, can be quite useful. My 45-degree angle on here, as I say, I'm just trying to find it, is there, look. So what that means is if you line up your straight edge of your quilting ruler with the straight edge of your fabric, so that's the cross grain, you can then mark that 45-degree angle, which is there, and then you can use that for a guide to make sure that when you cut diagonally, you can cut directly on the bias. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just working on this fat quarter because I'm going to use this to demonstrate how to not only make bias binding, but also how to attach it in two different ways. So I'm going to do 2-inch bias binding, which, I mean, there you go. Look, you can see how stretchy this piece of woven cotton becomes when you pull it on the true bias of the fabric. And then what I'm doing is I'm using my quilting ruler just to draw 2-inch lines from that diagonal bias line at the 45-degree angle. I'm just going to do a few, and then we will cut these strips using my rotary cutter. So we'll just do a couple more, and then I'll show you how I make bias binding with strips. As I say, there is a way you can make continuous bias binding which uses much less fabric. It's quite ingenious actually, but I'm not going to go through that today. The lovely Sam, who is Frugalissima, has done a tutorial on how to do that, and it's a very good tutorial, so I will link to that down below. But if anybody wants me to do it, then I'm more than happy to do that at some point. So I'm going to slice along the edge of my quilting ruler now, along the lines that I've just drawn, using my rotary cutter to cut these bias strips. And as I say, these are 2-inch strips. Now, when you are making bias, you can do whatever width you want, really. I tend to stick to about 2-inch strips. I would say if you're using a good stable fabric like cotton, you can go quite narrow. If you're using something a lot drapier like viscose, I would tend to go for wider, just because it can be tricky to handle, especially when you are using it on the bias. And when you're trying to fold it to make your bias folds as well, the narrower it is with a more unstable fabric, the actual, you know, it gets really quite awkward to be manipulating, which we'll come to shortly. But yeah, we're just cutting the strips here. I just want to apologize for the first part of this video as well about the light that's shining. You know, we've not had a great summer here in the UK, and then when we do get the sunshine on a day that I'm filming like this, it's really irritating. But anyway, so here we go. We've got the bias strips that I've cut, and what I'm going to show you now is how to join them all together to create a long strip of bias binding. So before we do any sort of pressing and folding, we're going to join these together, and you want to join them right sides together. And I've just zoomed in a little bit here to show you that when you actually pin these strips together, can you see how I haven't buttered them up directly? So I've left a tiny little gap at the top and the same at the bottom, and there's a reason for doing that. You can see that little little lap over there that I've left, and it's because when we've done the stitching we want the edges to be continuous and not have a jog in them, and that's why you don't want the edges to be totally buttered up. I hope that sort of makes sense. I'll show you when it's finished stitching here. I think I do show you what I mean. But right sides together we are stitching from corner to corner, but what you can see here is when you sew it, leaving a little bit of an overlap just there, like I have done there, and also there, it means that when you've sewn it and you fold it out, it runs continuously and there's no jog. So we're going to carry on attaching the other strips in exactly the same way and stitching to create one long bias strip, and we're just going from left hand corner to bottom right hand corner with a normal stitch, straight stitch, right sides facing, and then we'll have one long bias strip ready to start working on our project. So I'm just stitching the last strip onto this continuous bias strip that I've created. I'm losing my pins while I do it, and there we go. We now have one huge long bias strip. So what we need to do now is we need to just trim some of these raw edges off, so leaving a little bit of a seam allowance there, but for each of the strips that we've attached to each other we're just going to cut that down a little bit. And you'll notice as I work through this vlog that I don't press open the seams. I mean, you can do, but to be honest, I haven't found it makes much difference really when you're doing a bias strip. It just depends what fabric you're using, but you know, I really wouldn't worry about it. If you end up cutting these seam allowances a bit small and find it tricky to press them open, then just press them to one side. It's still going to work, it's still going to be fine. So I just cut off any little bits of the seam allowance that are sticking out like so, and now we have our long bias strip that we can make bias binding with. So now I'm going to show you on the ironing board how you can fold this, and there's numerous ways you can do it. You can use one of these little devices that you can pick up really cheaply on Amazon. I will show you how to use this shortly. You can get these in lots of different widths for lots of different widths of bias binding that you want to create, or you can do it the old-fashioned way. If you don't have any of that, you can just fold your fabric wrong sides together to create a crease, and then you open it out, fold up one edge towards that center crease like so. And if I'm doing it this way, I only press one side. I don't actually bother doing the other side, because you can use the other side, as I'm showing you now, as your first seam that you attach when you were doing your bias binding. So you don't have to actually press both seams into the center. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to use these little bias tape makers. I don't know what I'm doing at the minute, but nice shot of my rear end there for you all, guys. Anyway, I'm having a little mooch about in my sewing room. Oh, there we go. Look, I've got a stylus to show you. So this is really handy, because when you try and insert your tape into this little bias tape maker, you can use your stylus to poke it through the other end, and then it's got a little handle on it. What it does is it actually folds the fabric for you, and then you can just pull it along and press, and look at that. Look how amazing it is. So just keep pulling your fabric through and feeding it through the bias tape maker as so, and it creates bias binding just like that. It's amazing. So I'm going to carry on doing this till all of this fabric is made into a lovely double fold bias tape, and here you can see exactly what I made earlier. So now we've got handmade bias tape in, or what would be the fabric of your choice that hopefully matches your garment that you're making. So what we're going to do now is we're going back to our bodice, and I'm going to show you firstly the exposed way of creating bias binding. And to do this way is where you see a bias bound edge from the outside of your garment. So what you need to do is you attach the right side of the bias tape to the wrong side of your garment for this method, and then we are going to stitch it to the armhole from the wrong side. So I'm changing my foot on my sewing machine first to my edge stitching foot. That's the one with the little groove here, which helps me direct that groove into the crease that we've made of the bias tape, which you'll see in a second. And again, please excuse any bumps in the footage here and the light, because it's really awkward today when I'm filming this. But the little groove, I'm trying to just fit that into the crease, the first crease of my bias tape. And basically what I've done is I have lined up the raw edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of my armhole, and I'm starting at the underarm seam because that's where I'm going to want to make the join when this is finished, because that's the best place to have the join really, so that when this is fully finished you won't see the join. So I always start at the underarm seam, but I am just using a few stitches at a time, and I am just lining up the raw edge of the bias tape to the armhole from the wrong side, and we're just going to continue stitching, just a normal length straight stitch, nothing fancy, all the way round till we get back to the other side. And I'm not sure if I showed you this when I started it, but you need to leave a little bit of length of your bias tape, so don't start from the very edge of your bias tape. Leave probably an inch or two of a tail of your bias tape and then stitch. And you'll see why when we come back round to the other end, because this is how we're going to create a nice join when we join these up. There's different ways of joining bias tape in the round. There are lots of vlogs out there how to do it, and I'm just going to show you how I do it today. So we're just going over the shoulder seam here. So I've just opened out the shoulder seam allowance first. You want to make sure when you're doing this that you've finished your seams before you attach the bias binding. Obviously I'm just showing you this as a tutorial, but if this was a real garment that I was using, I would have finished the shoulder seam and the underarm seam before I started attaching the bias binding. So we're just working round the other side of the armhole back towards the underarm seam, and then I'm going to stop an inch or two before I get back to the underarm seam. I'm going to stop stitching at that point, and then we will create the join. We will join these two edges together, and I'll show you how I do that next. Right, so here we are back at the bodice with the first part of the bias tape attached, and you can see the underarm seam there, and I've got loose tails of bias tape that are not stitched. What we're going to do is we're going to fold the bias tape back on itself and just finger press it, and then with the other side we're going to do the same. We're going to put them up together and just finger press those in place, and then we're going to take them to the ironing board and give them a good press with the iron. And when you've done that, you should see a crease in the tape. So I've just cut off the excess here, but you can see my creases that I've just pressed with the iron, and I've moved the rest of the garment out of the way, and that's why you need to not be stitching right up to the underarm seam at this point. You're leaving that gap. So what we're going to do is where we've pressed it with the iron, we are just going to stitch along that line now using our edge stitching foot again, and we're just going to use our normal stitch at this point to close the bias tape together. And I'm just doing this in a straight line. I know you can do it diagonally, and lots of people do that, especially with quilting, but in dressmaking I just tend to do it in a straight line like so. We're going to press that seam out, as you can see, like so, and then we can finish off stitching it to the underarm seam along the gap that we left. So we'll just take that back to the sewing machine and do that, and then it looks like this. So now it is fully secured and closed. Now what we're going to do is we just need to give the raw edge a press. So what I'm doing first before we do this next bit is I'm just trimming off any loose threads that I've got, because we are going to be trimming down the seam allowance, and then we're going to be opening the bias tape and enclosing it on the outside of our bodice. But I'm just getting rid of all these little tails first, or any loose threads, just to tidy it up. And then you want to just open out this seam and go and give it a good press on the edge of your stitching line. So we're just going to press the stitching line. You don't want to press over your bias tape altogether, because it will press out the creases that you made when you made your bias tape. So I'm just showing you now that I've done that. All I've done is I've taken it to the ironing board just to press that stitching line, because it gives us a nice crisp finish on the inside. And then what we're going to do now is we are going to trim down this seam allowance, and I think I'm just grabbing my scissors here to do this, because we just want to reduce some of the bulk that's going to be enclosed within the bias tape. So I'm just using my scissors here. I'm being really you probably think I'm being really brave with this, because it's very easy to cut through your bias tape when you're doing this. So if you are inexperienced, I would suggest that you move your bias tape completely out of the way at this point while you are cutting down and reducing the seam allowance by half. That's generally what we tend to go with. But you know, I'm being brave or foolish or going rogue, however you want to describe it. But you know, at the end of the day, this is only for a tutorial. So I'm cutting down the seam allowance by half all the way round, but obviously not cutting through the bias tape, and that just helps us to remove a lot of the bulk. So when we're turning over the bias tape, it's easier just to enclose that raw seam. So I'm back round to the underarm seam now. We'll get rid of all those little scraps that we don't need. And then we've got the bodice now right sides out. So we've attached the first edge of the bias tape to the wrong side of the fabric, and now we are turning over that first edge that we created and then again to the outside of the fabric, and we're just going to pin it in place. And what I tend to do is I tend to work in quarters with this. So I will just do the underarm seam, then I'll do the next quarter, turn it round to the shoulder and pin the bias tape to the shoulder seam at this point here, and just secure that with a pin. And then I'll do the same for the other quarter, and then I will start working in between each pinned section. And I find it easy to do this because obviously we're working with bias tape now, which is stretchy, and we're working on a woven garment which is not stretchy, and we want to try and make sure that this is all nice and neat and there's no creases in it or puckering or anything like that. So you need to just work methodically with this, and don't be afraid of manipulating your bias tape. Now obviously I am demonstrating this on a very, very stable sample, which is calico. If you are working with a bodice that is perhaps made out of viscose, for instance, viscose is much more you need to be much more careful with it, because if I was using viscose here, what I would have done is I would have stay stitched the armhole first before I started attaching the bias tape. And the reason for that is because quite often you are pulling at your garment and you're pulling at the bias tape to make it go round the curve, and with a much more unstable fabric like viscose, like your silks, like your crepes, the lighter weight drapey fabrics, you can easily stretch the armholes out of shape, it would work exactly the same with a neckline. So something like that, I would tend to stay stitch it first, but because I'm demonstrating this on calico, I haven't done that. So once you're happy with how your bias tape is attached, we can then take it back to the sewing machine. And I'm still using my edge stitching foot, because what I'm doing now is I'm making sure that that little guide in the center of the foot butts up against the folded edge that we've turned over of the bias tape. So we're working from the top, we're working from the right side of the garment. Again, I'm starting at the underarm seam, just using a normal length straight stitch. Sometimes I increase the length of my straight stitch back to about 3.5. It just depends on what I'm working on. And then we're just going to, again, working a few stitches at a time and gently manipulating the armhole around. We're just going to continue stitching the bias tape all the way around. And what you probably haven't seen, or maybe you have seen but I didn't mention it, is that I've moved my needle across. I tend to move my needle across to 1.8. That's what it is on my faff. I don't know what it would be on your machine, and that gives me a really nice sort of top stitched edge to my bias tape. I'm doing this in black thread so that you can see what I'm doing, that it shows up with this being a demonstration. But obviously if this was your real life fabric, you would use thread that matched your garment, or if you wanted to make it contrasting, then absolutely, you could absolutely do that. There's no rules when it comes to sewing. This is your make and you make it exactly how you want it to be. So we're just going to continue until we get all the way back to the underarm seam, and then as you can see, I'm just removing pins as I work my way round. Sorry if the fabric is in the way of the camera. Taking the pins out as I work my way round and all the way back to the underarm seam, where we will just back stitch a couple of stitches and tie off like so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just snip those loose threads, and we're just going to give this a good press. And I tend to press my armholes over a tailor's ham, because this is a curved seam and you get a better finish if you press it over a tailor's ham than trying to press this on a flat ironing board. So I've given that a press, and then I'm just going to show you now how that looks. So here we are looking at it from the right side of the garment, and then you can see how that is top stitched down, and then from the inside of the garment it looks like so. And the stitching on the inside doesn't look as neat. You can see that because I've used a contrasting thread, but that's okay, and that's why it's on the inside of the garment. You want to make sure, if you're using an exposed bias tape armhole finish like this, that it is top stitched from the right side of the garment, so it looks really, really neat. So now we're going to move on to the other method, which is a concealed bias tape finish. So what I mean by that is that the bias tape sits completely on the inside of the garment, so you can't see it from the outside, and you just have a really plain, neat finish from the outside of the garment. So for this type of, well, for this method of attaching bias tape, we're working from the right side of the fabric, and again we're going to start at the underarm seam, and we're going to leave a tail again, because the finish of how we join this in the round I'm going to do in exactly the same way. So I'm leaving that 1-2 inch tail, and then I'm starting at the underarm seam. I'm just going to put one pin in place, so I'm working right side to right side now, and then we're going to take it back to the sewing machine and stitch it. So I've just done exactly what I did before, and then I've got the two tails and I'm back at the underarm seam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finger press these and then give them a press with my iron and finish off that edge. And then what we're going to do again is we are pressing the stitching line to give us a nice crisp finish. And what I'm showing you here is if we just fold this and stitch to the inside of the garment at this point, what will happen when you wear it is some of the edge of the bias tape will show on the right side. It will want to flip back out. So I'm going to show you an industrial way of finishing, and what we do is we're going to understitch the bias tape. Now I've shown you understitching before, and unfortunately I didn't press record when I did this bit, but basically what we're going to do, all we've done is we have understitched the seam to the bias tape, and then we're going to fold the whole lot to the inside like so. And because we've understitched it, as you can see there, it just means that it's going to sit really nicely on the inside, so when we're wearing it, the bias tape edge is not going to sort of show, it's not going to flip out and show. So it's just another little technique to elevate your sewing really and make sure this finish is a really professional finish. So again, what I'm doing is I'm working in sections as I pin this, and this is a little bit more tricky than the previous method because it's very easy to get wavy lines, to get puckering, and for this not to sit right. So you really need to take your time on getting this bias tape attached to your garment. And what you'll be able to see while I'm doing this is that I am really manipulating this bias tape into the curve of the armhole. So I'm really pressing and trying to sort of mold it to the shape of the armhole. You can see how I'm sort of moving the fabric around here. And when I've done those first few sections, what I then start doing is I start working with my pins perpendicular as I work around the armhole, and I'll go around it again, and I'm really manipulating the bias tape to the armhole so that it fits the curve and it molds into the curve, because we're not attaching bias tape to a straight seam here, we're attaching it to a curved seam that's going to hug your body. So it's very easy to get this where you end up with loads of puckers, and yeah, it just takes a bit of time and a bit of manipulation. Don't be afraid to work with your fabric and to really press it with your fingers, to mold it and just play with it so it molds it into shape. So just take your time, work your way around, unpin and repin and replay with the fabric to get it to a point where you're really happy with how everything is pinned in place. And then what we're going to do once we're happy with the pinning, before we start sewing, we are going to put some steam on this edge. So what I'm going to do, what you'll see shortly, is that I'm going to take it to my ironing board, and I am going to use a lot of steam with my iron, and I am going to steam the bias tape that I've pinned in place over my tailor's ham to really just get it to really mold itself and fit that armhole that I've pinned it to. And this will make all the difference when it comes to sewing, as you'll see shortly. So don't be afraid of using lots of pins here and really making sure that that bias tape fits absolutely 100% to the armhole. You know, you can really sort of pull, don't be afraid to pull the fabric. It's really good experience for you to get used to sort of manipulating fabric. So I'm back with my tailor's ham here, and I'm just using my iron to really steam what I've pinned, to fold the armhole over the tailor's ham, and using my iron to apply lots of steam to this pinned bias tape. Obviously be careful with your pins, dependent on the type of pins that you're using. Some of the pins that I've got here, these butterfly ones, have got plastic heads, and obviously they'll melt if I iron over them, so don't iron over plastic, it's not good. But I'm trying to just iron over the pins rather than the heads of the pins here, and it's just literally just giving lots of steam, lots of pressing to really make sure that that bias tape that I've pinned in place is really fitting itself into this armhole. And this was a technique that I learned a while ago, because previously I would pin the bias tape in place, I'd try and stitch it on the machine, and I'd end up with loads of puckers and it just used to look messy. So this really does make a difference, and it's just a little bit of extra time. I generally hand sew my bias tape to the main bodice of my garments if I'm using this method where I'm concealing the bias tape to the inside completely. But I'm going to show you on the machine today so that you can see how it works if you want to machine sew it. And again, I'm working from the wrong side because obviously that's how we're attaching the bias binding in this method. So again, I'm just using my edge stitching foot, and I've moved my needle over by 1.8 using the guide in the middle of my edge stitching foot buttered up against the edge of the folded edge of the bias tape on the inside of the garment. And I'm just going to stitch again, starting at the underarm seam all the way around. And what you should find now, because we've taken that extra time to really mold the bias tape to the area that it's fitting into, that this should stitch in perfect and you shouldn't get any puckers, any wavy lines, any dragging or anything like that, and you should have a really nice neat finish. Yes, you are going to end up with a top stitched stitching line on the outside of your garment, which you might be happy with. For me, my personal preference, as I say, is to hand stitch it, and I just make very little tiny stitches, almost like a blind stitch, so that you can't really see it from the right side. I just prefer that finish, but we're all different and that's absolutely fine. There is certainly nothing wrong with doing it this way, which is why I'm demonstrating this, because I'm sure you wouldn't want to watch me just sit and do a load of little hand sewing. But yeah, doing it this way is absolutely fine and it's much quicker, but you will end up with a stitching line that will show through on the right side of the fabric. So we're just continuing stitching all the way around the armhole, taking out the pins as we work our way along, stitching down that bias tape to the inside of the armhole of this sleeveless bodice, and then when we get right back the way round to the underarm seam, again just keep smoothing out your fabric to make sure there are no creases or any little areas that we're getting caught. It's really important to do that, otherwise you'll become very good friends with your unpicker. When we get back to the underarm seam, we just back stitch, and then we're going to just take this back to the iron and give it another press again, and here we are, the finished article. So we've got two versions, two methods of attaching bias binding. We've got the fully concealed method and we've got a bias edge that's exposed. Two methods, nothing wrong with either, just depends on your personal preference. You can see with this method, because of all that extra time we took to press it and steam it, it fits that armhole absolutely perfectly. We haven't got any drag lines and it's a really nice neat finish. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.